welcome to the Mythmatician's podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the people that count in the history of mathematics. I'm your host, Benjamin Cornish, and today we're taking the shortest path to a figure who occupies an almost mythical place in mathematical history, Pythagoras. Most people know him for the Pythagorean theorem, but there is so much more to this man, and to the mathematical and philosophical movement that sprang up around him. He wasn't just a mathematician, he was a philosopher, mystic, and community builder, whose ideas about numbers had an outsized influence on Western thought. So, whether you're a geometry enthusiast, a history buff, or a maths teacher looking for some classroom inspiration, settle in. Let's get to know the real Pythagoras. Now, you're still getting to know me as a podcast host, and I'm sure that over the decades it will take me to get through all the mathematicians up to the present day, you will come to know me very well. But one of the first things that would become apparent if you were to visit my house is that I'm a father of a 2-year-old. Or, if by now I'm up to the episode on Euler and you're just starting again from the beginning, maybe by now I have a 30-year-old who still lives at home. One of the delights of parenthood is the readjustment to the passage of time. There are whole months that pass by in a heartbeat, and then, on the rare occasion that one finds oneself in hospital, there is the occasional heartbeat that feels like it can take months. Generally though, as a parent of a 2-year-old, I spend the majority of my time sat in the dark next to her bed as she falls asleep, just to make sure that monsters don't get her. Sadly, when we were buying a house, we didn't think to check if it had monsters. The fun part of this nightly ritual is that I have no watch, no means of telling the time or duration. I just have to try to guess if she is asleep and face the consequences if I stand up too soon to leave. This is when I do the majority of my thinking, mainly for what pun to use in my next script. But in the sensory deprivation chamber that is my daughter's bedroom, I do like to wonder what it must have been like to live with no concept of time at all. Now, this is obviously not the world of Pythagoras. The ancients had pretty good records for time passing for millennia by now. They measured the number of days in years or months with respect to the stars, the sun, or the moon, each giving a slightly different result. As for the day itself, they knew that a day felt longer in the summer than the winter, that the middle of the day is when the sun is at the top of its regular arc, being rolled across the sky by a giant dung beetle. But the concept of 5 minutes would mean nothing to them. So let us imagine that you have to do everything from scratch. My favourite drinking game. You're transported back 2,500 years. What do? You might notice that if you divert some water from a nearby river through a small viaduct, the stream is pretty constant. You could then have it fill a large bucket that gets emptied every time it's full. You might then notice that that happens exactly 30 times between sunrise and sunset in midsummer, but only 19 times in midwinter. Boom! You've just invented a unit of time. For reference, this is not what I do when putting my daughter to bed, despite usually needing a wee. Perhaps a more obvious task would be, how do you reinvent a unit of distance? And the answer here is, throw a brick, you'll hit something. In fact, you could plausibly use the unit of 1 brick throw. The Egyptians relied on the royal cubit as a standard unit of measurement. The unit was defined as the length of a forearm stretching from the elbow to the tip of the middle finger, with an additional hand's width added for precision. To ensure consistency, the Egyptians created cubit rods made of stone or wood. The royal cubit measured approximately 52.4 centimetres. This precise standardisation was essential for the constructions of their monumental structures, including the Great Pyramids of Giza. The accuracy of the cubit rod allows workers to maintain the symmetry and alignment that makes these ancient wonders remarkable, even by modern engineering standards. The ancient Greeks used the stade as a unit of distance. The stade was originally based on the length of a typical sports stadium, a central feature of Greek cities. Over time, it became standardized for broader applications, including measuring land and marking distances for travellers. A stade measured approximately 180 metres. This unit not only provided a practical standard for daily use, but also influenced language and culture. For example, the modern term stadium for sports arenas is derived from the Greek stade. Similarly, the word stadia, used in modern surveying, has its roots in the ancient measure. The Romans introduced the mille passus, or 1,000 paces, as their standard unit of distance. A pace in this context refers to a full stride, both left and right steps combined. Thus, a Roman mile consisted of 1,000 such paces. You could, of course, tie a piece of string to your legs to ensure that each pace was the same distance. In modern terms, the Roman mile measured approximately 1,480 metres. This makes it slightly shorter than today's mile, which was later standardised in England to 1,609 metres. The Roman mile's practicality contributed to its widespread adoption throughout the empire, enabling the efficient communication and trade across vast territories. The point is, humans have been able to accurately measure things for a long time, including the lengths of right-angled triangles. More curiously, when these triangles have sides that are commensurable, that is, can be written in whole value ratios of each other, like 3:4:5 or 5:12:13, known today as a Pythagorean triple. Now, we have evidence of these ratios being known for a very long time. The earliest evidence for Pythagorean triples can be traced back to ancient Mesopotamia, with their presence documented in the mathematical practices of the Old Babylonian period, circa 1900 to 1600 BCE. These triples are famously associated with the Pythagorean theorem, but their use predates Pythagoras by over a millennia. One key artifact highlighting this knowledge is the Plimpton 322 tablet, discovered in the early 20th century. This clay tablet, written in cuneiform script and dated to around 1800 BCE, contains a list of numerical values organised in a way that suggests an understanding of Pythagorean triples. While its exact purpose remains debated, many scholars believe it served as a mathematical reference or teaching tool, possibly related to problems involving right-angled triangles or land measurement. But today we are here to discuss who Pythagoras is and what his legacy was outside of this misascribed curiosity. Let's begin with what we know, or what we think we know, about Pythagoras' life. I say think because Pythagoras lived around 570 to 495 BCE, and reliable historical records are scarce. Much of what we know comes from later sources, which mix historical facts with legends. Pythagoras was born on the island of Samos, a Greek colony in the eastern Aegean. His early life isn't well documented, but legend has it that he was a curious and brilliant child. As a young man, he travelled widely, possibly to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India. These travels exposed him to diverse mathematical and philosophical ideas, which he would later synthesize into his own teachings. At some point, Pythagoras settled in Croton, a Greek colony in southern Italy. There he founded a school that was part religious community, part philosophical academy, and part political organisation. His followers, the Pythagoreans, lived by strict rules. No eating beans, no picking up dropped objects, and a whole list of other peculiar prohibitions. Why such rules? Well, Pythagoras believed that every action should align with the harmony of the universe. But let's get to the heart of Pythagoras' philosophy. For Pythagoras, mathematics wasn't just a tool for solving problems, it was a way of understanding the universe itself. He famously declared that all is number. What does that mean? In Pythagorean thought, numbers weren't just abstract concepts, they were the building blocks of reality. Pythagoras believed that everything in the universe could be understood in terms of numerical relationships. The harmony of musical scales, the proportions of a temple, the orbits of the planet, all could be expressed through numbers, and in particular ratios. You might say that this is similar to Plato's famous view that all is geometry, everything comes down to triangles, and in some ways, Plato was right. You might say that this underpins Newton's view, that everything can be decomposed down into vectors of forces or energies, and in some way, Newton was right. You might even say that this feels similar to Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Dirac, and other modern greats, who say that everything comes down to probabilities. They might be right, but the odds are low, and we'll never find out. One of his key discoveries, or perhaps one made by his followers, was the relationship between musical harmony and mathematics. By stretching strings of different lengths and plucking them, the Pythagoreans found that pleasing musical intervals correspond to simple ratios of whole numbers. For example, a string half as long produces a pitch an octave higher. This discovery profoundly influenced Western thought. It suggested that the universe is governed by order and proportion, a deeply mathematical insight that to this day has a certain resonance. I should briefly draw attention here, although I don't intend to do this every time, that we cannot know whether this was an observation of Pythagoras or a student. But in truth, we can rarely know. Mathematicians are infamous for appropriating the works of their students. Just ask my teacher, who's currently presenting a podcast on maths history. And unless the students themselves go on to become one of the greats, we will almost never know. Arguably, half of the work ascribed to Newton was not invented by Newton himself. But it helps me to tell the story about a mathematician, not as an individual, but as a coalition of the people around them. The other fun story to drop in here is Stigler's law of eponymy, which states no scientific discovery is named after its original discoverer, a truth noticed by Robert K. Merton, which leads us into our next section. Of course, we can't talk about Pythagoras without mentioning the Pythagorean theorem. This famous result states that in a right-angled triangle, the square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides, or a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. But did Pythagoras himself first discover this theorem? No. As we discussed in my introductory ramble, the Babylonians and indeed Indians have known about it centuries earlier. What's more likely is that Pythagoras, or one of his followers, was the first to give a formal proof, or hallmark of Greek mathematics. The theorem became a foundation of geometry and remains a fundamental concept in modern maths. It's a brilliant example of how abstract reasoning can reveal deep truths about the world. For us teachers, the Pythagorean theorem offers endless opportunities for exploration, proofs, applications, its extension into 3 dimensions. How about challenging your students to prove it themselves? It's a great way to connect them to the ancient world of Greek geometry. Now, what would be the point of an audio-only medium of communication if I did not even try to talk you through a necessarily visual geometric proof? Strap in, because here we go. When selecting a proof to talk about, we have options. When I was at uni, I remember there being about 320. Checking now, there's an estimated 370 proofs on the market. It's not like we get a new one every day, but there is certainly scope. I've decided to show you one by a mathematician who quite probably will not get his own podcast. President James Garfield, the 20th President of the USA. His Wikipedia page is too full of the various war crimes committed by his government and the halls of Reddit-based online facts too concerned with him being fed through the anus. Feel free to look it up for yourself, or not, that's up to you. But the reason why I think he's one of the more notable presidents was his proof for Pythagoras' theorem that does not require the drawing of any squares. Consider a right trapezium, that is one with 2 right angles, with a top length of A and a base length of B and a height of A plus B. If we find the point along the vertical edge of the trapezium that is a distance B from the top and a distance A from the base, then we can connect this point to the opposing vertices of the trapezium with straight lines, thus forming two right-angled triangles. Each triangle will have lengths A and B and are therefore congruent, with a hypotenuse of C. Moreover, the triangles will be a rotation of 90 degrees relative to each other. Thus, the two lines C will form a right-angled triangle. Now, we can consider the area of this trapezium. First, if we measure the area as one single shape, we can use the formula for a trapezium that is the average of the parallel sides multiplied by the height. A plus b over 2 multiplied by a plus b. Or even better, fully expanded, 1/2 of a squared plus b squared plus 2ab. Second, we can measure the area as three triangles. Two of the triangles are congruent and each have an area of 1/2 a times b, and the other triangle has an area of 1/2 c squared, which yields a total of 1/2 of 2ab plus c squared. But when seeking to prove an identity, we often try to describe the same thing in two different ways. Here we have two expressions which both describe the area, therefore they must be equal. This gives us the equation 1/2 of a squared plus b squared plus 2ab is equal to 1/2 of 2ab plus c squared. From here you may spot that we can simply multiply by 2, cancel the 2ab terms, leaving us with a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. Here's a plot twist. While Pythagoras celebrated the harmony of the whole numbers, his school stumbled upon something deeply unsettling, the existence of irrational numbers. Legend has it that a Pythagorean named Hippasus discovered that the square root of 2 couldn't be expressed as a ratio of whole numbers. This was a shock to the Pythagoreans, who believed that all numbers were rational. How could the diagonal of a square be incommensurable with its side? The discovery of irrationals reportedly caused an existential crisis for the Pythagoreans. In some versions of the story, Hippasus was exiled or even thrown off a ship for revealing this uncomfortable truth. Whether or not that's true, it's clear that the discovery challenged the Pythagorean worldview. Let us remember back to episode 1, discussing aims, that there were constants that were understood in mathematics, like pi, although they were of course not named this, but even these were believed to be expressible as the ratio of two numbers, initially thought to be 22/7, and then improved to 16/9 squared. For us maths teachers, this story is a great way to introduce students to the concept of irrational numbers. It shows how mathematical discoveries can upend long-held beliefs and push us towards deeper understanding. So what's Pythagoras' legacy? His influence extends far beyond the Pythagorean theorem. First, there's his impact on philosophy. Pythagoras and his followers laid the groundwork for Plato and the entire Western philosophical tradition. Plato was deeply inspired by Pythagorean ideas, particularly the belief in an underlying mathematical order to the universe. Then there's his contribution to the development of mathematics. The Pythagorean school played a crucial role in the transition from practical arithmetic to theoretical mathematics. They were among the first to study numbers for their own sake, setting the stage for the abstract approach that defines modern maths. Finally, Pythagoras' mystical and holistic view of numbers continues to resonate. His ideas about harmony, proportion, and the interconnectedness of all things still inspires mathematicians, scientists, and artists alike. Pythagoras' life is shrouded in myth and legend, which means there are plenty of colourful stories. Some historical, some more likely apocryphal. But here's a few memorable ones. One of the most famous anecdotes about Pythagoras is his supposed golden leg. According to legend, during a moment of divine revelation, Pythagoras pulled up his robe to reveal that one of his legs was made of solid gold. This was interpreted by his followers as proof of his divine nature. While it's almost certainly a fabrication, the story illustrates the reverence his followers had for him and the mystical aura surrounding his life. Pythagoras and his followers were deeply interested in purity, and they had peculiar rules for conduct and rituals. One unusual anecdote claims Pythagoras forbade the sacrifice of roosters because they were sacred to the sun and symbolized the cycle of day and night. This story underscores his blend of mysticism and philosophical inquiry, where even everyday actions were imbued with cosmic significance. Pythagoras famously forbade his followers from eating beans, and the reason for this prohibition are peculiar as they are varied. One explanation is mystical. Pythagoras believed beans contained the souls of the dead, and consuming them could disrupt the transmigration of souls, a concept central to his beliefs. Another explanation is more practical. Some historians speculate he may have linked beans to flatulence, which he considered undignified. A dramatic twist on this story comes from an account of Pythagoras' death. It is said that when he was pursued by enemies, he ran to a bean field, but refused to cross it, staying true to his prohibition. Rather than defile the sanctity of the beans, he accepted his fate and was killed. Personally, I prefer the ending to the story that said Pythagoras had to run around the outer edge of the rectangular field of beans so as to not run through the beans, but the soldiers didn't have to follow that rule, and they ran along the hypotenuse and managed to catch him before he got out the other side because the distance was shorter. These anecdotes, whether true or not, reveal how Pythagoras became more than just a mathematician. He was a larger-than-life figure, part philosopher, part mystic, part cult leader. They also provide a fascinating lens into how people of his time and beyond understood his contributions to both mathematics and spirituality. Pythagoras was more than just a mathematician. He was a philosopher, a mystic, and a visionary who saw mathematics as the key to understanding the cosmos. His work reminds us that numbers are not just tools, they are windows into the deep structures of reality. For us as teachers, Pythagoras offers a rich trove of stories and ideas to bring into the classroom. His life and work show students that maths is not just about calculations. It's about curiosity, discovery, and the pursuit of truth. But better still, he stands as a role model and example to us all, that if we can be good enough maths teachers, maybe our students will form a religion around us. I guess only time will tell. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of Pythagoras. Over the next week, we will be repeatedly halving the time before meeting our next target. Let's find out in the next episode if we'll ever arrive at Zeno. It would be paradoxical to miss it. Until then, goodbye. The music today is Danse Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.